Hi. So I'm introducing the second of our topic-based sessions. It's on borders, barriers, and AMR. And our first speaker is a Russian academic, but she's currently based in the Netherlands. And she focuses on actual borders, like borders on lands that people cross or try to cross and get sent back. So the problem of migration and AMR, I think, is familiar to people, but yeah, we're going to hear more about that now. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much for the introduction, Catherine. I will share my. Yeah, thank you so much for this conference and for inviting me to be part of it. My name is Alona. Catherine introduced. I work in Maastricht University in the Netherlands. The talk that I'm presenting today, I think I've been presenting bits and pieces of this research also in other instances, so in case of a repetition, I apologize for that. But I think it's a piece of work that I've been engaged with in the last few years and keep trying to think through it, and would be also happy to get your further insights and just share my current work on it. So it's titled Foreign Bacteria of an Interconnected World, where I put kind of a little bit of provocative title at the beginning, and I hopefully try to unpack it throughout the conversation. So I want to start by showing you this map. It's a print screen from Flight Radar. I took this print screen, as you can see, I think at 8:30 in the evening. I think it was a Saturday or Sunday. So maybe not so many flights are presented on the slides. But when I look at it and we see this kind of hundreds of flights crossing different geographical territories, I think different people will probably engage different interpretation of how we can see these continuous movements of people and all kind of microorganisms that they carry with themselves. We can think about interconnectedness of the global world. We can think about climate change. We can think about continuous mobilities of people. We can think about power relations, people who can afford to take the flight and who cannot afford to take the flight. But I think in a nutshell, what we see is this continuous movements of people across different territories. This kind of interconnectedness on the logistical landscape of our world. However, when we think about movement of microorganisms, the movement of bacteria, there I think a very specific discourses can be traced throughout the history of infectious diseases. And there, I quite like to refer to this book of Alan Kraut. When we speak about infectious diseases and its global distribution in the world, we cannot avoid but come across in our biomedical and epidemiological literature narratives about countries of origins and countries of destinations. This kind of search for a region of the virus, search for a region of bacteria is very much embedded in the way we think and do research on infectious diseases. And if we look at the kind of histories of how we think about the development of particular infection, then we often come across a character that Priscilla Wald referred to as this archetypical stranger. It's usually a foreigner from a distant land that is associated with the massive spread of infection. And in her book, she used example of a typhoid Mary or Mary Malone from Ireland, or Gaëtan Douglas, a Canadian flight attendant for spreading HIV in the US. So the stories of kind of foreign strangers spreading infectious diseases are not uncommon, and not just in our kind of literature, in our media discourses, but also in our scientific language. And that's the point where, for me, it's become very interesting to understand when we speak about discourses of biomedical sciences, of microbiology, what are the narratives that's been built there when we speak about antimicrobial resistance as this global phenomenon, as the global problem? Kind of what is the global about it and how it is presented. And I think people in the room familiar with quite a big body of work that's been looking into metaphors and antimicrobial resistance. There've been beautiful work produced looking into metaphors of war and apocalypse when speaking about antimicrobial resistance. It's been communicated as this kind of apocalyptic problem that come upon us. In my work, I was more interested in what is called conventional metaphors. And here I'm referring to George Lakoff, Andrew Reynolds, who speak about conventional metaphors as these seemingly literal descriptive expressions that are not seen as metaphors anymore, yet they carry with them this kind of trail of metaphorical meanings. Even if they are kind of underlined by our assumptions. This is a bit of a busy slide, but basically what you see on the left is a picture that I add to give a little bit of an image demonstration of what a conventional metaphor refers to. On the left side, you see a honeycomb and the cells of a honeycomb. And on the right side, you see a picture of a frog skin under a microscope. And also, although the concept of a cell in our biomedical sciences is not seen as a metaphor anymore, Andrew Reynolds in his book showed that the concept of a cell has been originally invented as a metaphor in the 17th century by Robert Hooke, who compared his observation through microscope to a honeycomb, cells of a honeycomb. And obviously now when we speak about organic cells, we might not immediately think of a honeycomb. However, the visual presentation of an organic cell is still very much remind us of that original comparison with a honeycomb cell. And then what you see on the right side is the list of articles that I've been analyzing in the last few years. They are published between 2016 2018. They're all published within the field of microbiology, and they're looking into the acquisition and distribution of ESBLE across the world. I realized right before the meeting, I was going through my slides, and I realized that I forgot to add my methodology slide, but I will quickly just say that I collected these 9 articles, which is a very small representation. But those are the articles, research done by one of the major groups in the field who've been studying the acquisition and distribution of ESBLE across the world. And I conducted discourse analysis with those articles, with the main focus of tracing this kind of conventional narrative of speaking about the antimicrobial resistance as the global problem. And here's the slide that I often like to show when I speak about this topic. And one of the reasons also why I like to show it is because it was published by my colleagues in Maastricht. So I got a chance to also speak with people who created this map. And in it, basically what you see is this was research conducted in the Netherlands, and they were following healthy travelers. So people who traveled from the Netherlands to those different parts of the world, and then they returned back to the Netherlands. Their stool samples were collected and tested for ESBLE. And then the percentages you see are the percentages of the acquisition by travelers when they return back to the Netherlands. And if you look, the 9 articles that I looked through, you can see in the kind of nutshell a very clear narrative throughout those articles. Basically, what we have when we speak about the global distribution of antimicrobial resistance, especially research done on healthy travelers, so not patients, we have our home countries. Those are usually countries where laboratories are located and where participants were recruited for research. And those are the countries from where travelers were going to those different parts of the world. Their travel destinations often referred to as reservoirs for antimicrobial resistance. And then while traveling to their travel destinations, our travelers become colonized, in this case, by ESBLE, and travel back home from where they originally came from. So this is kind of a very rough skeleton of a narrative that we can see in many of the biomedical discussions when we speak about acquisition and distribution of antimicrobial resistance just by traveling throughout the world. So that picture with the planes going all over the world. In this, two conventional metaphors that particularly caught my attention and I would like to speak also with you about. First one is the concept of a reservoir. It's quite a common concept when we speak, when we took biology classes, when you speak with the researcher who study infectious diseases or antimicrobial resistance specifically, this concept is not uncommon to hear. It refers to a continuous source of pathogens, often associated with specific territories, spaces, or lived organisms such as rats, bats, pangolins. In case of COVID, we also heard that. And also in the article that I looked into, we see that antimicrobial resistance reservoirs are associated with specific territories. Indian subcontinent is often mentioned as one of such reservoirs, as well as travelers themselves, but not travelers who are going to their countries of destinations, rather returning travelers. So returning travelers who visited countries' reservoirs, becoming reservoirs themselves. But this kind of seemingly descriptive concept that we can see in most of the articles that study global distribution of antimicrobial resistance, I think it's important to reflect upon kind of the historical trail that this concept is bringing with itself. Because when we assign some object, space, territory, or a group of people with the characteristics of being a reservoir, we are giving them a characteristics of often being risky or unclean, poor hygiene, and etc. And if you look again into the history of infectious diseases, we will see that very specific territories, such as low and middle income countries, as well as very specific groups, especially migrants and ethnic minorities, have been assigned these characteristics of a reservoir, meaning that they've been targeted also by political and economic actions to drain this reservoir, justified by public health actions. And I think that's one of the important points to reflect upon, this kind of historical trail that conventional terminology brings with itself. And then the second term that I would like to also bring forward is the concept of bacterial colonies. The concept of a colony, again, in biomedical sciences is not uncommon. We've been seeing it in colonies of ants, colonies of animals, and bacterial colonies are not an exemption here. And if you go to Oxford Dictionary of Biochemistry and Molecular Biology, we will get a definition that it is a circumscribed group of cells, normally derived from a single cell or small cluster of cells growing on a solid or semi-solid medium. So we don't have any reference to an original metaphor here. However, if you want to look into the etymology of the word and go into Oxford English Dictionary, for instance, we will see that the concept of a colony has been referred to a territory administered by a foreign ruler or a settlement of Roman citizens in newly conquered or hostile territory. All the seemingly different definitions, they're actually not that different if you think about it. When we refer to bacterial colonies as this kind of intruders or invaders, unwanted elements that colonize territories or bodies where they're not supposed to be, it's still a very common way of thinking of bacterial colonies that link back to its kind of historic trail of a metaphoric connotation. And why I think this is important to reflect upon this conventional terminology, going back to this map and discussing also with my colleagues from the Department of Microbiology, kind of what to do with this. Should we change the terms? Should we think of some different concepts? And I said, well, I feel like an analysis like that and kind of self-reflection on the terminology and the very material practices that our discourses are bringing us is very important point of understanding how we speak and approach antimicrobial resistance as this global problem. Because again, if we return to this map, we will see that there is not a global in this map. It's very particular countries, kind of half of the world is only here. The second half of the world is not present in this picture. And all the research been conducted by a group from the Netherlands, and all samples were processed in the Netherlands, and travelers were coming also from the Netherlands. We do not see Netherlands on this map. So it's kind of become very absent. And when I asked researchers who created this map why it is given a very one-dimensional vision of the world and one-dimensional vision of antimicrobial resistance as the global problem, I got quite pragmatic answers saying that participants for this research were recruited through travel clinics, and only you go to travel clinics when you travel only to specific countries. But I feel if we zoom out a little bit from this specific research and think about this kind of concept of global and this duality that we see in this map, I think we are forgetting about those interconnectedness that we saw in the first pictures with the planes going in and out from different countries. And I put here a picture of an article that was published just a few weeks ago in Social Science and Medicine, which I think showed this quite nicely, this geographic interdependencies in antibiotic production in the world, and making us think about codependencies beyond geopolitical borders of the countries when we think about antibiotic production, when we think about antimicrobial resistance as a problem. However, when we look into how science about the global problem of antimicrobial resistance is made and talked about, it still very much reflects this kind of power relations between laboratories situated in different parts of the world and different researchers producing different types of knowledge that has different power connotation to it. And just as a kind of final thoughts to end this presentation, I think especially when we speak about such problem as antimicrobial resistance and COVID, very recently there were a lot of discussions about viruses no border, bacteria no borders. We know that borders still very much important as for our political life as well as for public health, as they're often used as these biosecurity tools to prevent specific groups and populations from crossing those borders based on different types of discriminatory discourses, and some of them also coming from being justified by public health discourses. And we see also in the production of knowledge about antimicrobial resistance as a global problem, we still can see this duality as well. So borders still very much matter in the way we think about the global of antimicrobial resistance. Thank you. I think I finished here.